the most powerful narrative of the three. It's the one that appeals to your morality and values, not just as an American, but as a human being. The value of freedom and democracy. This is the part of the story that says, Venezuela is not just a failed economy, it's a dictatorship, and we need to fight for democracy. We need to stand up for people's freedom and their right to vote and their right to live without oppression. It's the kind of story that makes you feel good and noble to support. And that's partially because there's truth to it. Nicolas Maduro has consolidated power. The leaders who opposed him have been arrested. Protesters have been crushed. Elections have been heavily controlled. And there is a long, long history of corruption. Those things are all very real. But here's what's also real. The United States doesn't care about any of that when it happens to countries that support its interests. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Qatar, none of those are democracies, but they are allies. We don't call them dictatorships. We just call them partners. It's very selective in how it goes about it. It's about who's allowed to have power and who's allowed to sell their oil and to whom. Because when a country like Venezuela teams up with countries like China or Russia, then all of a sudden, their elections start to become really important for some reason. All of a sudden, human rights become a priority, and there's an urgency to fix the problem. It's the same pattern we've seen again and again. Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, even Syria. And I remember noticing this first back in 2008.
The more victories you amass, the easier the next victory becomes. The first victory in Afghanistan makes the second victory in Iraq that much easier. The second victory in Iraq will make the third victory that much easier too.
Now looking back at it, it's so obvious how the same story just keeps repeating. The invasion of Iraq, for example, was sold to us partially under the guise of freedom and democracy. Libya, same thing. It was about protecting people from Gaddafi, but it turned into another power vacuum. Then Syria, Afghanistan, which was supposed to end terrorism and rebuild democracy. Every one of these conflicts started with the same premise, doing the right, moral thing. And every time, the result's always the same. Instability and another country left in ruins, more immigration and refugees coming to the US to seek asylum. So the point is, to sell a story to as many people as possible, there have to be multiple appeals to value in order to convince someone that going to war is a good idea. So then the question is, if all of those narratives are what they want us to think, what's the real reason then? And the real reason is the same thing I've been mentioning in all my videos. It's about getting control over resources, holding on to influence, and keeping oil out of China's hands, and sort of reminding the rest of the world, even if the US can't control everything anymore, it can still punish those who step out of line. So let me explain what I mean by this, because it's both complex and very, very simple. And here's the simple explanation.
How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door.
Obviously, it's always been about oil, but it's also something bigger. It's about influence over the world. It's control of who gets to decide the price of oil and the price and the strength of a currency, and eventually the balance of world power. Now, Venezuela, again, sits on the biggest proven oil reserves in the world, roughly 300 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iran, more than anyone. And that's what makes it so valuable and so important. For decades, the US has relied on this cheap energy and the dominance of the US dollar to settle these oil transactions. And it helped reinforce that system. That's where the term petrodollar comes from. Every barrel traded through this petrodollar system has strengthened America's position. But over the last few years, I think we've seen the acceleration of this sort of crack. China and Russia, for example, have been building their own network and teaming up so that they could bypass the dollar. That's why we keep hearing about de-dollarization and BRICS expansion. And while all of this is happening, the US was sanctioning Venezuelan oil. So China was like, hey, we'll help you out, right? We'll lend you the money. China becomes Venezuela's biggest creditor. So far, it has lent at least $60 billion to keep its economy alive, at least that we know of publicly. And in return, China got long-term access to that oil. So every barrel Venezuela has strengthens China's energy security. It weakens US leverage. That's why when the two presidents met recently, Xi didn't even look like he needed or wanted to be there. That's a position of power. That's a problem. It's not necessarily that Venezuela is corrupt or its economy is bad or that they mistreat their people, regardless if those things are true or not. When you combine that with what's happening around the world, with Saudi Arabia joining BRICS and Russia weaponizing its energy exports and China making oil deals in yuan backed by gold, the US is sort of watching its influence in the world slowly disappear. That's really scary for a country whose global power has been built on the ability to control the flow of that energy and the value of money. Now, I did say, though, at the start of this part that the real answer was both complicated and very, very simple. So that was the simple explanation. But I also think there's a slightly more complicated, nuanced answer for why all of this is sort of happening.
A Israel hacia una autodestrucción y además está escalando los niveles de violencia. Fue a Estados Unidos y le rindieron pleitesía toda la élite estadounidense. Toda. Hasta los que lo criticaban. Hasta los que dijeron que no lo iban a ver. Lo tuvieron que ver. Y entonces él se fue de Estados Unidos con la carta blanca para bombardear Irán, el Líbano, bombardear a todo el Medio Oriente, a los pueblos árabes, a los pueblos musulmanes.
So that was a criticism of one of America's most powerful allies. Now, I'm not saying that that is the reason the US has a bounty on Venezuela's president, which it does, but I think it's one of many powerful incentives that make this story what it is. And in a way, the story is sort of about what happens in the modern day to a country that defies very powerful interests. And what's even more interesting is how the US is going about this, because we're not seeing troops on the ground. The US doesn't need to invade anyone. It just has to cut them off. For some countries, that works, like in the case of Venezuela. And for some countries, it doesn't. Countries like Russia and China. They're just too big and too independent at this point. But by leaving Venezuela out of the global banking system, the US made it almost impossible for the country to trade and to ship oil or even buy parts for its infrastructure. Insurance companies don't want to touch them. Ships avoid their ports. So, yeah, of course their economy is going to collapse into corruption. We're like, see, you guys need freedom and capitalism. But I think there's an irony to all of this, which is the harder the US squeezes, the more Venezuela turns to countries like China and Russia and Iran for help. That's how new alliances are created here. It's not because they share the same values. It's because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Every time the US pushes someone out of the dollar system, that country joins a long list of countries that are like, yo, join the club, right? So that's exactly what we're watching right now. It's the creation of a new energy/monetary system that runs without the US in the middle of it. Saudi Arabia is joining BRICS. China signing oil deals in yuan backed by gold now. Russia is trading energy through its own payment networks. Venezuela is sort of helping energize that system by shipping oil to China outside the dollar. All of it, over time, I think, contributes to this chart, the slow erosion of US dollar leverage. And once you lose control of that, you lose control of everything. And every time something like this happens, the story is always kind of the same, right? It becomes an appeal to your moral values, whatever they may be, to justify a conflict that resets this game. Now, if you made